internet. Joy here, and today's video is going to be part 2 of the Offence series, in which we're going to talk about cultural appropriation. So, what is it, and why is it so bad? Well, Wikipedia does a much better job, fuller job, of explaining cultural appropriation better than I'm going to here, because I have a lot to get through and there's just not enough time. But basically, it's the concept of people from one culture adopting habits such as clothing, fashion, art style, speech cadence, etc. from another culture. But why is that wrong? Well, defenders of cross-cultural pollination see no harm in the exchange and assimilation, the appreciation and admiration of cultural elements. However, it's only bad when it's exploitative, i.e., a dominant culture appropriating from marginalized minority groups without regard to any original context. And let's be clear, much of this cross-cultural pollination that I'm talking about hasn't happened in the most innocent of ways. Basically, they're saying that learning and sharing is not the same as fetishizing and trivializing aspects of another's culture, and that would be when appropriation is bad. Let's look at a few examples, shall we? There's one really obvious one that sort of springs to mind at the moment. It's all about the top of the head. Yeah, that's right. It's about white people wearing dreadlocks. Well, if the question is, can white Caucasian people wear dreadlocks, then the answer is yes. Hair twists and mats in pretty much the same way for everyone. So anyone can dread their hair. The real question being asked there is, should they be allowed to? And my real answer would be, well, go for it. Your hair, your life, you do what you want, honey. You do you, boo. But it's not my culture that's being appropriated here, or at least might be being appropriated. Now, some people, just don't care. But dreads are so heavily tied and associated with Rastafarian culture. You have to really ask the source, them, what they think. And some Rastas are so critical of white folks wearing dreads, like nothing more than just an accessory, that they get offended and angered. So a quick internet search will show you that dreadlocks have been around for a very long time, and they have in fact existed far, prior to Rastafarian culture. Ancient Crete, ancient Egypt, ancient Asia Minor, the Caucasus, the East Mediterraneans, North Africa, Hindu and Buddhist sects. Over time, they have been seen in many different, remote and separate cultures, as well as, of course, Central Africa, where they were then adopted by the Rastas whose roots in Jamaica, from that grim period of the world's history known as the slave trade. But they were, inspired to wear their hair that way by the Nazarites mentioned in the Bible. And it's only much later But reggae music in the 60s and 70s brought that particular element of the counterculture through the reggae movement, hippies, punks, goths, all the way through to modern era fashion, who's, you know, we look at like Christian Dior actually had a Rasta inspiration in one of his collections. And there is, over time, filtering into the mainstream. No one culture can claim ownership of dreads because it's been seen in so many and it's been filtered through so many layers of time. And in each culture, they kind of seem to symbolize different things. So, talking of hair, of course, we do have to mention the other sort of obvious thing that's going on here, and that is whenever somebody eats at a Chinese or an Indian restaurant or takeaway in the West. Now, is that cultural appropriation? Is somebody who eats from these places stealing a part of the culture? Is it being whitewashed for the sake of capitalism? Or is it just the actions of people trying to share and sell their culinary traditions and skills to others who just enjoy the flavors? Which, let's face it, that's what I thought I was doing the other night. And I think the answer is pretty clear here, that it serves as an example of how difficult it is to properly define the concept of cultural appropriation. I think the key thing here is consent. Now, let's just take a hypothetical bunch of Chinese people who open a takeaway across the street from me. Oh, look, it already happened, like 5 times. But they chose to do that. So it can't really be called cultural appropriation. But what if they had no other choice for a good, decent life? Is capitalism forcing their hand into commodifying their particular culture? And that's the question I don't have an answer for. Let's look at another example. Something that's, fairly obvious and also fairly relevant for this particular time period. Dia de los Muertos. The celebrations and traditions that happened very recently, of course. So let's talk about that. Now, sugar skulls are icons that appear everywhere. But why is it called cultural appropriation if somebody paints their face to make a point? But not when, the makers of games use the imagery just to sell units. One could argue that it's easier to criticize an individual than a company, but I want to take a look at a few examples of that. So, for example, the game Skull. Okay, it's a great game, and I do love it. It has great reviews, and as far as I can tell in those reviews that I've seen from, Amazon, just go look it up. No backlash for cultural appropriation there, despite the obvious sugar skull imagery and the seeming lack of any connection to any Mexican tradition, although my research there was a little bit lacking and inconclusive. I do have to be honest about that. I couldn't find anything one way or the other. So anybody who does have any information about that, please leave comments. I'm willing to learn. Let's talk about Mortal Kombat. They introduced Day of the Dead skins for their mobile game. and again received no backlash, and in fact they received a lot of praise for including these characters, because they were actually pretty strong in the meta, as well as just, really cool and awesome looking. But, despite the obvious cash grab that was going on there, like, it was actually seen as a nice way of honouring the tradition by most fans, and I'm sure that that was at least part of the intention of the creators, was to honour that tradition rather than just completely rip it from its roots and make a quick buck. But let's face it, that's also mixed in there. That's what makes this whole concept rather nebulous and difficult to define. But then again, you've got sugar skulls as, popular tattoo ideas. And, no one's stopping your basic white bitch from having, sugar skull tattoos. And they seem to get, no hassle at all for their, permanent life decisions. But you get, people like Natalie Wynn, aka ContraPoints, who is, let's face it, no stranger to controversy. Love you, Nat. She gets a heap of trouble for this one video she made years ago about cultural appropriation, where she paints her face as a sugar skull. One time. Now, I get it. Your culture is not a costume. But she said as much pretty much explicitly in the video. She was doing it to make a satirical point. And she still got backlash for it. What? And yes, incidentally, I did get into trouble for doing the same sort of thing a few years ago, but for different reasons. And, obviously I've had to take the time to research what Day of the Dead actually is and what it means and when it is and all of that. And it would seem that despite that, there is no excuse for doing it. Because the thing is, unless you talk to someone about what their intention actually is, you can't know whether their intention was mockery or homage. So wearing something, unfortunately, just seeming to be just a costume, you can't tell if there's any act of expressing, the knowledge and reverence there. You can't tell what's in another person's head. And so, siding with, caution, you can be sure I won't be doing that sort of thing ever again in the future. Okay, but I've been dancing around it, and I am going to have to address the big elephant that's in the room, of course. Blackface. Can't talk about cultural appropriation without mentioning blackface, which is ironic because it's not actually an example of cultural appropriation because skin color isn't a culture. But performing that is a cultural tradition. A very, very racist one. So, last year, TV personality Megyn Kelly said some very insensitive things about thinking that it's okay to wear blackface. In specific, she was talking about one particular white woman painting her face dark to look like Diana Ross as a Halloween costume. Now, even as intended to homage a person, using imitation as the sincere form of flattery that I think it was meant to be, it still falls short because of the long, tumultuous history of racism in the US and how blackface ties into that. This act did not happen in a world without context. Blackface arose as a way to caricature African American people in a very unflattering, dehumanizing, and humiliating way. And it played off racial stereotypes of the 19th and 20th centuries. It's always offensive because it's based off this distortion of reality, for basically played for cheap laughs at best, and vilification of an entire race of people at worst. Let's take, for example, The Birth of a Nation. It's a film, it was made just over 100 years ago, and in it there are some black people portrayed by white folks in blackface who are shown to be savage, unintelligent, and sexually aggressive towards white women. And it presents the Ku Klux Klan as the heroic force that stops them. That's just really fucked up. On a slightly less damaging part of the sliding scale of racism, we have minstrel shows, and they made African Americans out to be nothing more than zoo entertainment. But sadly, mainstream entertainment would follow in that tradition for quite some time and largely not allow real African Americans to play black roles in the US up until like the mid-20th century. So a history of a particular cultural performance really doesn't get more racist than that. So out of deference to the sensitivities of the people who were, and in some instances still are, an oppressed minority, we don't do blackface. It's just always offensive. Of course, I am going to have to talk about the mohawk, which is fucking falling down. Yeah, okay. I tried my best. But do you understand how much hair gel and backcombing it takes to get it up, like... Look, I am wearing a hairstyle that is literally named after an oppressed minority. I get it, okay, I do. But, just like the dreadlocks, this style has more than one meaning and more than one origin. Recently it was discovered that in about 2,000 years ago, at least one person was wearing it in Dublin. The Scythian warriors circa 600 BCE used to wear a mohawk style, and even the 16th century Ukrainian Cossacks would wear a mohawk style. Obviously they had different names for it, but again, it's an example of one thing not being the same universally. Now look, I'm not a stranger to the historical, like, context that we're talking about here. The only explanation I can offer, and I hope that it's the decent explanation, I am a punk girl, okay? And this is my way of showing my cultural history, i.e., that is being a part of the counterculture. Again, dating back to the 70s and 80s punk goth movement. So, there you have it. I hope you've learned something. I hope I edit this fucking properly and, make it look alright. And this fucker stands up. I will see you all soon. Take care. Not to offend anyone. And as always, I leave you with the tagline, non-binary is valid, goddammit!